At 10:15 in the morning on August 17, 1943, General der Jardinier Adolf Galland stood at a railway platform, departing Rheinland-Heath in East Prussia, watching Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring board his luxury train. They had just finished a conference about Luftwaffe fighter operations. Galland needed to deliver critical intelligence before Göring departed. The intelligence concerned American fighter aircraft appearing deep inside German airspace. Earlier that day, on August 17th, Luftwaffe fighters had intercepted a massive American bomber raid targeting Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The engagement had followed predictable patterns. German fighters waited at the border. American escort fighters, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, turned back as expected once their fuel ran low. The bombers continued deeper into Germany without protection. Luftwaffe squadrons attacked. Then something unprecedented happened. More American fighters appeared. Not Thunderbolts, different aircraft. They engaged German fighters over 150 miles inside Germany, far beyond where any escort should have been able to reach. Galland had collected reports from squadron commanders across the Reich. The American fighters were Lockheed P-38 Lightnings equipped with external drop tanks. The drop tanks extended their range dramatically. This changed everything. Galland approached Göring at the railway platform. He presented his findings directly. American fighters with extended range were penetrating deep into Germany. Squadron commanders reported P-38 Lightnings equipped with drop tanks engaging over Schweinfurt, over Regensburg, over targets that should have been beyond escort range. The tactical doctrine of waiting for escorts to turn back was no longer viable. Göring listened, his face reddened, his voice rose. He declared that American fighters had not reached that far into Germany. The reports were wrong. The fighters Galland described must have been damaged aircraft that glided eastward from great altitude after being hit over France or Belgium. They were flukes, anomalies, not evidence of extended range capability. Galland protested. He explained the drop tank system. Multiple squadrons had reported the same encounters on the same day. These were not damaged aircraft gliding. These were fighters in full combat capability, engaging German aircraft deep inside the Reich. Göring cut him off. The Reichsmarschall stated it was physically impossible for American fighters to reach that far inland. He gave Galland a direct order. He officially asserted that American fighters had not crossed into central Germany. This was an order. Galland understood immediately. Göring was denying reality. The Reichsmarschall refused to accept intelligence that contradicted his assumptions. Galland replied with what witnesses later described as an unforgettable smile. "Orders are orders, sir." The train departed. Galland watched it leave. He knew the Luftwaffe had just lost its opportunity to prepare for a threat that would destroy it. What happened next would doom thousands of German pilots who would die fighting an enemy they were told did not exist. The losses began immediately after Göring dismissed Galland's warning. On August 17, 1943, the same day as the railway platform confrontation, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 25 to 27 fighters during the Regensburg-Schweinfurt raids. Many fell to the long-range P-38 escorts that Göring insisted were impossible. The twin Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission demonstrated exactly what Galland had warned about. American bombers penetrated deep into Germany with continuous fighter escort, far beyond previously observed ranges. German fighters that attacked the bombers were engaged by P-38 escorts appearing from altitude, at unexpected distances from England. The exchange was brutal. 60 American bombers were destroyed that day, but German fighter losses and pilot casualties were severe. The mission represented a watershed moment. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced American bomber formations escorted throughout their entire penetration into German airspace. The tactical assumption that escorts would turn back at predictable points had been shattered. German fighter commanders now had to assume American escorts could appear anywhere, at any time, far deeper into Germany than doctrine suggested was possible. 3 weeks later, on September 6, 1943, another disastrous engagement proved Galland's warnings correct. A formation of American B-17 bombers struck Stuttgart, with P-38 escorts reaching deep into southern Germany. Major Egon Mayer of Jagdgeschwader led the interception. Mayer was one of Germany's most successful bomber-destroyers with 57 kills. He had pioneered the head-on attack against American heavy bombers, recognizing that frontal attacks minimized exposure to defensive fire. On this mission, Mayer's squadron attacked from ahead of the bomber formation as planned. They scored hits on several bombers. Then P-38 escorts dove from altitude. The escorts had been positioned above and behind the bomber stream, waiting for exactly this moment. Mayer's formation scattered. 3 German fighters were shot down in the first pass. Mayer himself barely escaped when a P-38 got on his tail. He pushed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a steep dive and outran the heavier American fighter, but 5 of his squadron did not return. 3 pilots killed, 2 captured after bailing out. 0 bombers were confirmed destroyed. The mission was a complete failure. By October 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. American bombers were striking deep into Germany with fighter escorts that Göring had declared impossible. The Luftwaffe continued fighting using tactics based on assumptions that were demonstrably false. Pilots were told escorts could not reach certain targets. They planned their attacks accordingly. Then the escorts appeared and shot them down. On October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, another Schweinfurt raid resulted in catastrophic losses for both sides. The Americans lost 60 bombers. The Luftwaffe lost 38 fighters with pilots killed or wounded. On December 4, 1943, Hauptmann Wilhelm Lemke of Jagdgeschwader 3 was killed near Dodewaard in the Netherlands. Lemke had 131 kills and was one of Germany's most successful aces. He was shot down during combat with P-47 Thunderbolts of the 352nd Fighter Group. He was 23 years old. The loss of experienced aces like Lemke represented an irreplaceable depletion of the Luftwaffe's combat effectiveness. The Black Thursday raid demonstrated both the strength and weakness of the American bombing strategy. 60 bombers lost in a single day represented 9% of the attacking force. 600 aircrew killed or captured. Such losses were unsustainable without fighter escort to the target and back. The American 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids for several weeks after Black Thursday to rebuild strength and await the arrival of more long-range escorts. But for the Luftwaffe, the raid represented something equally ominous. Despite achieving their highest bomber kill count of the war, German fighter losses were approaching parity with bomber kills. The Luftwaffe had destroyed 60 bombers, but lost 38 fighters and 42 pilots in the process. Before the advent of long-range escorts, the exchange rate had been 3 or 4 bombers destroyed for every fighter lost. Now it was approaching 1-to-1. At that rate, the Luftwaffe would be ground down through attrition long before American bomber strength was seriously degraded. Galland understood mathematics. He compiled another detailed report in November 1943. The report analyzed monthly fighter losses from June through October. June, 87 fighters lost. July, 106. August, 174. September, 193. October, 224. The trend was unmistakable. Losses were accelerating. Worse, the ratio of experienced pilots to novices was inverting. In June, 60% of fighter pilots had more than 6 months combat experience. By October, only 40% did. The Luftwaffe was losing its most valuable asset, experienced pilots who could survive combat and train the next generation. Galland warned that without immediate intervention, the fighter force would reach a critical breaking point within 6 months. After that point, losses would exceed the training pipeline's capacity to produce replacements. The fighter force would enter a death spiral from which recovery would be impossible. He sent the report to Göring, to the Air Ministry, to anyone in the chain of command who would listen. The response was silence. Göring refused to acknowledge the crisis. The Air Ministry issued directives calling for improved morale and more aggressive tactics. Nobody addressed the fundamental problem that German pilots were outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outmatched by better-trained Allied opponents flying superior long-range fighters. Galland documented every loss. He compiled reports. He sent weekly summaries to Göring and the High Command. He described the tactical situation in detail. American fighters with extended range were escorting bombers throughout German airspace. The old doctrine of waiting for escorts to turn back was obsolete. New tactics were needed immediately. Fighter production needed to increase. Pilot training needed to expand. The Me-160 jet fighter should be rushed into service despite development problems. Its speed advantage would allow it to penetrate escort screens and attack bombers. Galland received no response from Göring. The Reichsmarschall had made his decision in August. American long-range fighters were not a strategic threat. The Luftwaffe would continue current operations. Nothing would change, but everything was about to change. The situation deteriorated through November and December 1943, as American fighter capabilities expanded beyond even what Galland had warned about. Then, on December 1, 1943, something new appeared over Germany that made the P-38 threat seem manageable by comparison. The North American P-51 Mustang entered combat. The P-51 had been flying for 2 years in various roles. The Royal Air Force used early versions for low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack. The United States Army Air Forces used them in North Africa and the Mediterranean. But these early Mustangs had Allison engines that performed poorly at high altitude. They could not escort bombers in the stratosphere where the air war over Germany was fought. German intelligence knew about these early Mustangs. Luftwaffe analysts had concluded they posed no threat to high-altitude bomber operations. The North American Aviation installed the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the Mustang airframe. The Merlin had a two-stage supercharger that maintained power above 30,000 feet. The combination of the Mustang's efficient aerodynamics and the Merlin's high-altitude performance created something extraordinary, an American fighter that could fly as high as any German fighter. Faster than most German fighters at altitude, turned with German fighters in a dogfight, and with twice the range of any previous escort. When fitted with 2 external drop tanks, the P-51 could fly over 800 miles from its base, spend time in combat over the target, and return home. Berlin was 600 miles from England. Every industrial target in Germany was now within reach of escorted daylight bombing. On December 1, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group flew the first P-51B combat mission over Europe from Boxted Airfield in England. The unit had received its aircraft only days earlier, having trained on P-39 Aircabras back in the United States. Many pilots had less than 5 hours in the P-51 before their first combat mission. But the aircraft was intuitive to fly and forgiving of pilot error. It responded crisply to controls, accelerated rapidly, and could sustain high-speed maneuvering without losing energy. American pilots who had flown P-47s described the Mustang as flying like a fighter half its weight. On December 5th, the P-51s escorted bombers to Amiens in northern France. On December 11th, they reached Emden on the German coast. On December 13, 1943, they achieved a breakthrough that changed the air war permanently. 55 P-51 Mustangs escorted B-17 bombers to Kiel for 180 miles from England and to 140 miles inside Germany. The mission lasted for hours and 30 minutes. The Mustangs engaged Luftwaffe interceptors over the target and shot down 6 German fighters without loss. American bombers struck U-boat construction facilities with minimal interference. The mission proved that American heavy bombers could now reach any target in Germany with fighter protection. The escort problem that had plagued the strategic bombing campaign since 1942 was solved. Galland recognized the threat immediately. He flew to Berlin to meet with Göring in late December 1943. He presented intelligence on the P-51, technical specifications, performance data, combat reports from pilots who had engaged the new fighter. The P-51 was faster than the Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 at all altitudes. It could turn with German fighters. It had a longer range than any previous escort. With external drop tanks, it could reach any target in Germany. Galland recommended emergency measures. All available resources should focus on fighter production. The Me-160 jet program should receive top priority. Training should be accelerated despite fuel shortages. Germany needed to adapt immediately or face strategic defeat in the air war. Göring dismissed the concerns. He stated the P-51 was just another American fighter. German pilots were superior. German tactics were superior. The Luftwaffe would prevail through skill and courage. Galland argued. He showed Göring the intelligence reports. He explained what would happen if P-51s escorted bombers to Berlin. Göring refused to listen. The meeting ended. Galland returned to his headquarters knowing the Luftwaffe had sealed its own fate. The American strategic bombing campaign intensified through January and February 1944. P-51 Mustangs appeared in growing numbers. They escorted bombers to Frankfurt, to Leipzig, to targets throughout central Germany. Luftwaffe losses climbed steadily. Then, on February 20, 1944, the Americans launched Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, 6 days of concentrated attacks on German aircraft factories. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe's production capacity and force German fighters into battle where they could be annihilated. Over 3,500 American bombers struck targets across Germany, all escorted by swarms of P-38, P-47, and P-51 fighters. The Luftwaffe committed everything to stopping the raids. Every available fighter squadron threw itself into the battle. Experienced aces flew multiple sorties per day. New pilots with minimal training were rushed into combat. The casualties were catastrophic. During Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost 260 to fighters destroyed and another 180 damaged beyond immediate repair. Pilot losses were even worse. Approximately 100 pilots killed, 90 wounded, 43 missing. Among the dead were squadron commanders, flight leaders, and experienced combat veterans who could not be replaced. Major Egon Mayer, who had survived the September 6 disaster, was killed on March 2, 1944, shot down by P-47 escorts over France. He had 100 kills. He was 29 years old. Hauptmann Kurt Ubben of Jag-Geschwader II was killed on February 22 during a bomber interception over Braunschweig. He had 110 kills. He was 24 years old. These were not novice pilots. These were the core of Germany's fighter expertise. The men who trained new pilots, the leaders who organized effective tactics, the aces who could engage multiple enemies and survive. They were dying at rates that made replacement impossible. Galland watched the casualty list with growing despair. A fighter pilot needed 6 months of training to be minimally competent, a year to be good, 2 years to be excellent. Germany was losing pilots with 2, 3, 4 years of combat experience, replacing them with pilots who had 3 months of training. Some new pilots arrived at frontline squadrons with less than 200 total flight hours. They faced American pilots with 400 to 500 hours of training. The skill gap was enormous. The outcome was predictable. New German pilots survived an average of 5 combat missions. 5 missions. Then they were killed or wounded. The Luftwaffe was being destroyed not just through losses of aircraft, but through the systematic annihilation of its pilot corps. The training crisis had complex causes. Germany had never planned for a long war of attrition. The Luftwaffe training system in 1939 had been designed to produce a steady stream of replacement pilots for a force that would achieve quick victories through tactical superiority. It assumed that experienced pilots would survive to lead new pilots and pass on combat knowledge. It assumed that fuel for training would always be available. It assumed that training airfields would be safe from enemy attack. By 1944, all these assumptions had proven false. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could train replacements. Fuel allocations to training schools had been cut repeatedly to prioritize frontline operations. Allied fighters and bombers attacked training airfields, destroying aircraft and killing instructors. The training pipeline that had produced excellent pilots in 1940 had collapsed into a system that sent barely competent pilots to their deaths. Galland tried desperately to fix the training system. He requested increased fuel allocations for flight schools. He recommended pulling experienced pilots from combat for instructor duty. He proposed shortening the operational tours of highly skilled pilots so they could survive to train the next generation. Every request was denied. Göring insisted that all available resources go to frontline operations. Germany needed fighters in combat, not in schools. The Reich could not afford to pull experienced pilots from battle to teach when those pilots were needed to defend against daily American raids. This logic was superficially correct, but strategically suicidal. By refusing to invest in training, Germany ensured that its pilot quality would decline continuously until the force could no longer function effectively, regardless of how many aircraft were produced. The Americans understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. In early 1944, General James Doolittle, who had taken command of the 8th Air Force in January, changed the fighter escort doctrine. Previously, American fighters had been ordered to stay close to the bomber formations and provide direct protection. Doolittle gave his fighters freedom to pursue German aircraft aggressively. Fighter groups were sent ahead of bomber formations to hunt for Luftwaffe fighters while they were forming up. Mustang groups were tasked with strafing German airfields to destroy aircraft on the ground. The goal was not just to protect bombers, but to destroy the Luftwaffe completely by killing pilots and destroying aircraft wherever they could be found. The new doctrine was devastatingly effective. German pilots faced American fighters not just over the target, but throughout their entire mission. Taking off from their airfields, they could be attacked during climb-out. Forming up, they could be bounced by roaming Mustang patrols. Approaching the bombers, they had to fight through escort screens. After the engagement, returning to base with damaged aircraft and low fuel, they could be pursued and shot down. There was no safe phase of operations. American fighters were everywhere, and they had the numbers, performance, and pilot quality to dominate every engagement. On March 4, 1944, the strategic situation reached a point of no return. American bombers struck Berlin for the first time with full fighter escort. Over 600 heavy bombers attacked the German capital. Escorting them were 174 P-51 Mustangs that flew the entire 1,100-mile round trip. The Mustangs fought German defenders over the heart of the Third Reich. They shot down 16 Luftwaffe fighters. They lost only for aircraft. Berlin, the city that Hermann Göring had promised would never be bombed, was now within range of American daylight bombing with complete fighter protection. Göring reportedly said privately that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost, but he said it privately. Publicly, he continued insisting everything was under control. The Luftwaffe was still strong. German pilots were still the best in the world. The Americans would eventually run out of aircraft and pilots. Germany would win. The reality was very different. By April 1944, Galland faced a crisis so severe that he filed a report directly with the High Command, bypassing Göring entirely. The report was dated April 27, 1944. It outlined the catastrophic state of the Luftwaffe fighter force. In the previous 10 major operations, the Luftwaffe had lost approximately 500 aircraft and 400 pilots. Over the previous 4 months, from January through April, more than 1,000 pilots had been killed, wounded, or captured. The enemy outnumbered German fighters 6-1 in some operations, 8-1 in others. The standard of Allied fighter pilot training was astonishingly high. Most American and British pilots entering combat had 400 to 500 hours of flight time. German pilots were being sent into battle with less than 200 hours. Some had less than 150. The training infrastructure had collapsed due to fuel shortages and constant Allied attacks on airfields. Galland stated in his report that he would at this moment rather have 1 Me-162 in action, rather than 5 Bf-109s. The Me-162 was the jet fighter that Galland had advocated deploying for months. It was faster than any Allied fighter by 100 miles per hour. It could break through escort screens and attack bombers without being intercepted. But Hitler had insisted it be developed as a bomber, not a fighter. Precious months had been wasted converting it to carry bombs instead of maximizing its potential as an interceptor. By the time Hitler reversed his decision in late 1944, and allowed jet fighter production, it was too late to stop the hemorrhaging of the Luftwaffe fighter force. The losses continued through spring and summer 1944. Between January and May, 2,260 German fighter pilots were killed, wounded, or went missing. March alone saw catastrophic attrition. Luftwaffe records show that in March 1944, the fighter force suffered extraordinary losses that effectively broke its back. Entire squadrons were decimated. Jagdgeschwader 11 lost 28 pilots in 3 weeks. Jagdgeschwader 3 lost 31. These were elite units with years of combat experience. They were being shattered against overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. The numbers told the story of annihilation. Germany could lose 10 fighters and struggle to replace them within a month. The Americans could lose 100 fighters and replace them within days. The British could lose 50 bombers and have them replaced within a week. The industrial capacity was not equal. The pilot training pipeline was not equal. The strategic situation was not equal. Germany was losing a war of attrition it could never win. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The Luftwaffe was supposed to contest the invasion with massive fighter and bomber strikes against the landing beaches. Luftflotte 3, responsible for defending France, had 481 aircraft available on June 5. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe managed to fly 319 sorties. The Normandy campaign marked the final collapse of Luftwaffe effectiveness in the West. Oberst Joseph Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, was one of Germany's most successful fighter leaders with 101 kills, including 68 Spitfires, the highest score against that aircraft type. On D-Day morning, Priller and his wingmen, Feldwebel-Heinz Waterchick, were the only German pilots to attack the invasion beaches directly. Flying to Focke-Wulf FW-190s from Lille at extremely low altitude to avoid detection. They strafed Sword Beach, then escaped back to base. Their two aircraft constituted the entire German fighter response to the largest amphibious invasion in history. Priller later stated the mission was suicidal, but necessary to show that the Luftwaffe had not completely abandoned the German army. He survived the war and died in 1961. The weeks after D-Day saw some of the most desperate and futile air combat of the entire war. Luftwaffe units threw themselves against overwhelming Allied air power in a doomed attempt to support German ground forces. Losses were staggering. By the end of June 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 300 fighters in the West. By July, Galland was receiving casualty reports showing 50 fighter pilots killed or missing every single day. Every day, 50 pilots. The Luftwaffe pilot training schools graduated approximately 30 pilots per week. The mathematics of annihilation were simple and stark. There was no way to sustain operations at these loss rates. The fighter force was dying. Squadron commanders reported that new pilots arriving from training were effectively helpless in combat. They lacked basic combat skills. They could not maintain formation. They panicked under fire. They made fundamental errors that got themselves and their wingmen killed. One experienced squadron leader compared receiving new pilots in mid-1944 to executing them. Sending these undertrained pilots into combat against seasoned American and British fighter pilots was tantamount to murder. But there was no choice. Germany had no reserve of trained pilots waiting. Everyone who completed training went immediately to the front and died within weeks. Galland tried everything to change the situation. He pushed for increased production of the Me-160 jet. He advocated for improved training programs, even though fuel shortages made extensive training impossible. He developed new tactics for engaging heavily escorted bomber formations. He personally flew unauthorized combat missions to understand what his pilots faced and to test new approaches. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem was not tactics or training or equipment. It was numbers. The Americans and British had achieved air superiority through overwhelming numerical advantage backed by superior training, better logistics, and unlimited industrial capacity. No amount of German tactical innovation could overcome that reality. There were pilots who understood what was happening and tried to adapt. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff commanded Jagdgeschwader 77 through much of 1944. He was an experienced leader who eventually reached 176 kills. Steinhoff recognized immediately that old tactics would not work against the new American escorts. He developed aggressive approaches. His squadrons would not wait for escorts to turn back. They would attack immediately, engaging the escorts first to drive them away from the bombers. It was aggressive. It was risky. It achieved some success, but the cost was enormous. Steinhoff's tactics worked in the sense that his unit shot down more enemy aircraft than average, but his losses were also higher than average. For every enemy aircraft destroyed, Jagdgeschwader 77 lost nearly to fighters. At that rate, no unit could sustain operations for more than a few months. The best German pilots were dying. The most innovative commanders were being killed. The tactical knowledge built over years of combat was being lost, and there was no one left with enough experience to replace them. Galland himself experienced the futility firsthand on an unauthorized mission in the spring of 1944. He flew a Focke-Wulf FW-190 over Magdeburg, wanting to see what his pilots faced from the cockpit rather than from reports. He found a massive bomber formation escorted by at least 50 fighters. The escort consisted primarily of P-51 Mustangs flying in loose formations above and beside the bombers. Galland picked out a bomber on the edge of the formation and rolled into an attack. Just as he began to position for the shot, tracers streamed past his canopy. From Mustangs that dived on him from above. He broke hard and dove. The Mustangs followed. Galland used a trick from earlier in the war. He fired his machine guns forward, creating streams of smoke that drifted back toward the pursuing fighters. giving the illusion of rear-firing guns. The Mustangs broke into a climbing turn. Galland used the opportunity to dive away and escape at high speed. He returned to base without firing a shot at the bombers. He had been in position to attack for less than 5 seconds before being engaged by escorts. He understood immediately why his pilots were failing. The American escorts were everywhere, aggressive, skilled, and outnumbered German fighters by margins that made success impossible. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force existed primarily on paper. There were squadrons listed in organizational charts. There were pilots. There were aircraft being produced, but there was no cohesive fighter arm capable of defending German airspace. Fuel shortages grounded entire units for days at a time. New pilots crashed during training because they had insufficient flight hours. Aircraft sat on airfields without spare parts for repairs. When squadrons did manage to launch missions, they faced overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters and bombers. On November 2, 1944, Galland sent 500 fighters against 975 American bombers attacking oil plants. Escorted by 800 fighters, 600 of them P-51 Mustangs, the Americans shot down 98 German fighters, killing 78 pilots. The Americans lost only 50 aircraft total, 30 of them to anti-aircraft guns. Germany could no longer afford such losses. Hitler and Göring were furious. With the Ardennes offensive being planned for December, Hitler ordered Galland to prepare his fighter reserves to support the ground attack. Rather than defend the Reich, elite fighter wings that had fought for years would now move to support a ground offensive that had no chance of success. Galland knew his plan Großschlag, the big blow against American bomber formations, was finished. In January 1945, Galland was relieved of his command as General der Jagdflieger on January 13th. Göring blamed Galland for the Luftwaffe's failures, the constant complaints, the defeatist reports, the criticism of leadership. Göring told his staff that Galland had undermined morale and failed to inspire his pilots to achieve victory through willpower and determination. The relief came after what became known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt, when several senior fighter commanders met with Göring to express their grievances about the conduct of the air war. Galland was accused of orchestrating the meeting to undermine Göring's authority. He was placed under house arrest at his hunting lodge. He faced possible court-martial, even execution. The SS and Gestapo opened files on him. Heinrich Himmler sought to put him on trial for treason, but Hitler intervened. The Führer knew Galland's reputation as a skilled combat pilot and respected leader. Hitler also recognized that court-martialing Germany's most famous fighter ace would be a propaganda disaster. Hitler allowed Galland to return to active duty on one condition: Galland would form and command Wave Band 44, an elite jet fighter unit equipped with Me-160 aircraft. The unit would be manned by the best surviving fighter pilots in Germany. Galland accepted immediately. He gathered 10 holders of the Knight's Cross, experienced aces who had survived years of combat. Among them were Johannes Steinhoff with 176 kills, Gerhard Barkern with 301 kills, and Heinz Brühr with 220 kills. These were some of the most successful fighter pilots in history. They received Me-160 jets beginning in late February and March 1945. The Me-162 was everything Galland had claimed it would be. The aircraft were magnificent. Top speed, 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. For 30mm cannons with devastating firepower, could reach 30,000 feet in 7 minutes. The jet engines gave it acceleration that piston engine fighters could not match. In combat, the Me-162 could choose when to engage and when to disengage. Allied fighters could not catch it in level flight. They could not catch it in a dive. The only way to shoot down a Me-162 was to catch it during takeoff or landing, when it was slow and vulnerable, or to damage it so severely during a head-on pass that the pilot could not control it. Allied fighter pilots quickly learned to patrol near known Me-160 bases and attack the jets while they were low and slow. This led to fierce battles around German jet airfields where Allied fighters tried to catch jets during their most vulnerable moments, while conventional German fighters tried to protect them. Galland flew his first combat mission in the Me-162 on March 31, 1945. Flying from Munchenheim Airfield, he intercepted a formation of American bombers near Neuburg. He shot down a B-26 Marauder with a short burst from his 30mm cannons. The bomber came apart under the concentrated firepower. Over the next 4 weeks, Galland added 6 more kills, all heavy bombers. His squadron, Jagdverband 44, destroyed 45 Allied bombers and fighters during March and April 1945. But it made no difference to the outcome of the war. Germany was collapsing from all directions. Soviet forces were fighting in the streets of Berlin. British and American forces had crossed the Rhine and were advancing rapidly through western Germany. German cities were in ruins from years of strategic bombing. The fuel supply had essentially ended. Aviation gasoline production had collapsed after Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants. Even elite jet units were grounded for days at a time due to lack of fuel. Jagdverband 44 flew its last combat mission on April 26, 1945. Galland led 12 Me-62s from Munchenheim to intercept American bombers. At approximately 1500 hours, while engaging a formation of bombers south of Munich, Galland's aircraft was hit by fire from a P-47 Thunderbolt piloted by First Lieutenant James Finnegan of the 56th Fighter Group. The P-47 attack came during a vulnerable moment when Galland was focused on setting up a shot against a bomber. He heard and felt the impacts. 50 caliber rounds tore through his canopy and instrument panel. Both engines were hit. Metal splinters from the instrument panel struck his right knee. He felt a sharp rap against the kneecap. The aircraft was severely damaged, but still flyable. Galland broke off the attack and dove away from the combat area. He nursed the crippled Me-160 to back toward Munchenheim. Both jet engines were running rough and losing power. The instrument panel was destroyed. He flew by feel and landmark navigation. At low altitude with a barely controllable aircraft, he managed to crash land near the airfield. X-rays taken later showed metal splinters embedded in his kneecap. The injury was not life-threatening, but was severe enough that he could not continue flying. He was removed from command due to his injuries. Johannes Steinhoff took over Wave Band 44. 8 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended. The April 26th mission was notable for another reason. It represented perhaps the last time a German fighter ace of Galland's stature flew in combat. His final victory count stood at 104, all against Western Allied aircraft. He had flown 705 combat missions over 6 years of war. He had been shot down 4 times and survived each time. He had commanded the Luftwaffe fighter arm during its most critical period. He had tried desperately to reform a system that was fundamentally broken, and he had failed. Not through lack of skill or effort, but because the strategic situation was unwinnable and the leadership refused to accept reality. In 1979, 34 years after the war, Galland met James Finnegan at an Air Force Association meeting in San Francisco. A graduate student had matched Finnegan's combat report with German records and arranged the meeting. The two men talked for hours about the engagement. Finnegan described seeing the Me-162 making an attack run on the bombers and positioning his P-47 for a shot. Galland described feeling the hits and struggling to keep the damaged jet flying long enough to reach friendly territory. They discussed the aircraft, the tactics, the experience of combat. There was mutual respect between them. They had both been professional military pilots doing their duty in a terrible war. The meeting was filmed and later became an important historical document, one of the rare occasions where a pilot and the man who shot him down met decades later to discuss the engagement in detail. Adolf Galland survived the war. He was captured by Allied forces and spent time as a prisoner until 1947. After his release, he worked as a military advisor to the Argentine Air Force for 6 years. He returned to Germany in 1955 and worked as an aerospace consultant. He published his autobiography, The First and the Last, in 1954. The book detailed his experiences as General der Jagdflieger and his conflicts with Göring and Hitler over air strategy. It became one of the most important primary sources on Luftwaffe operations. Galland lived until 1996. He died at age 83. In interviews throughout his life, historians asked Galland about the turning point of the air war. When did he know Germany would lose? Galland consistently pointed to August 1943, the moment he tried to warn Göring about long-range American fighters penetrating deep into Germany. He knew then that the Luftwaffe faced a threat it could not overcome. If leadership refused to adapt, He had presented evidence. He had recommended immediate action, and Göring had given him an order that no such threat existed. That decision, Galland argued in later years, cost Germany any chance of maintaining air superiority. If the Luftwaffe had adapted in August 1943 when P-38s with drop tanks first appeared, perhaps different outcomes were possible. Perhaps more resources could have been allocated to jet fighter production before it was too late. Perhaps training programs could have been expanded before fuel shortages made it impossible. Perhaps tactics could have been developed to counter the numerical superiority of Allied fighters before the pilot corps was decimated. But Göring had refused to acknowledge the threat. He had called it impossible. He had ordered Galland to stop reporting such intelligence. And by the time the crisis became undeniable, it was far too late. The Luftwaffe fighter force had been shattered. Thousands of pilots killed. The most experienced leaders dead. The training pipeline collapsed. Germany lost air superiority over its own territory and never regained it. The strategic bombing campaign continued unopposed through 1945. German cities burned. Factories were destroyed. Transportation networks collapsed. Oil production fell to levels that grounded entire air units. The war became unwinnable not because Germany lacked courage or skill, but because it had lost control of its own airspace. And it traced back to August 1943 when a general tried to warn his commander about a threat. That was dismissed with an order denying reality. Galland never received official recognition for his warnings. No commendation, no acknowledgement that he had been correct. Official Luftwaffe records attributed the collapse of the fighter force to overwhelming Allied numerical superiority and insufficient German resources. Galland's name appeared in reports as the officer responsible for fighter operations. During the period of decline, there was no mention that he had predicted the crisis, no mention that he had recommended solutions months before they became desperately needed, no mention that he had been ignored by leadership that preferred comfortable assumptions over uncomfortable facts. After the war, military historians researching the Luftwaffe found extensive documentation of Galland's August 1943 confrontation with Göring. They found the railway platform exchange recorded in multiple sources, including memoirs by Albert Speer, who witnessed part of the conversation. They found Galland's intelligence reports about long-range American fighters. They found Göring's dismissive responses and his order asserting that no such threat existed. They found subsequent combat reports proving that American fighters were indeed penetrating deep into Germany exactly as Galland had warned. The historians interviewed surviving Luftwaffe pilots. Almost all confirmed similar experiences. They had been told repeatedly that American fighters could not reach certain distances into Germany. They were told to wait for escorts to turn back before attacking bombers. They were told the losses were temporary and would improve. The losses never improved. They got worse every month until the Luftwaffe essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Military analysts concluded that Göring's refusal to accept Galland's intelligence in August 1943 was one of the most consequential command failures of the entire war. By denying reality, Göring ensured that the Luftwaffe would be unprepared for the threat that ultimately destroyed it. If Germany had taken Galland's warnings seriously, the outcome of the air war might not have changed dramatically. The Allies had overwhelming industrial and numerical superiority, regardless of German tactical adaptations. But the war might have been longer and more costly for the Allies. Perhaps months of additional time for Germany to develop countermeasures. Perhaps significantly higher Allied aircrew casualties. Perhaps different strategic calculations by Allied leadership. If bomber losses had remained prohibitively high, even with fighter escort. But none of those possibilities were explored because Göring dismissed the warning and ordered his fighter commander to stop making such reports. The consequences of that dismissal shaped everything that followed. This is how command failures manifest in war, not through dramatic betrayals or obvious incompetence, but through the refusal to accept uncomfortable intelligence, through dismissing evidence that contradicts existing assumptions, through punishing subordinates who report problems instead of addressing the problems themselves, through giving orders that deny reality rather than adapting to changed circumstances. Adolf Galland tried to warn his superiors. He presented facts. He recommended solutions. He was ignored, and thousands of German pilots died as a result, fighting an enemy they had been told did not exist until it was far too late to prepare an effective defense. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.